This is The Killer Chronicles. In April 2005, Keith Barnes sat down in his federal prison cell and penned a letter to an assistant U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C., explaining that, for years, his pleas had been falling on deaf ears, and it was a matter of life and death. He desperately wanted to be relocated to any other prison system besides the one that currently housed him, the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Barnes was a notorious informant in a Washington, D.C. murder case, and his enemies lurked around every corner. He wrote, "My current unit team is treating my request for non-BOP placement with deliberate indifference. Instead, they want to feed me to the wolves by constantly attempting to send me to general population. There is nowhere I can go in the Bureau of Prisons without a DC inmate knowing about my situation. I have no one else to turn to." Barnes's letter was nothing new. For years, he'd written anyone he could think of, prison staff, attorneys, even his congresswoman, with the same exact request. But there was something special about this letter. It would be the last one Keith Barnes would ever write. Less than a month after sending it, Barnes was transferred to USP Beaumont in Texas and placed in general population. Less than a day later, Barnes's body was found inside a cell with 106 stab wounds. Barnes's murder was a response to policy set by the United States Congress, sprawling gang culture in the federal prison system, and the age-old adage, snitches get stitches. It all started on April 11th, 1996, when a group of 4 Washington, D.C. residents, including a 17-year-old Barnes, a 17-year-old James Rat Carpenter, 20-year-old Jimmy Jimbo Pearsall, and 18-year-old Theo Mitchell. The 4 showed up to the Chesapeake Street apartment of Israel Dog Jones, a local drug dealer who was rumored to have cash hidden in his apartment. 3 of them were armed with pistols, and Barnes kicked down Jones's door expecting him to be home. Barnes's version of events, as recounted during his sworn testimony, follows. When they discovered Jones was not there, Pearsall and Mitchell left to find Jones while the other 2 stayed behind to search the apartment. They discovered Jones on South Capitol Street, talking to his sister, and convinced Jones to come with them by assuring Jones's sister that they just wanted to talk, and agreeing to take one of Jones's friends along as well. On the drive, they dropped off Jones's friend, but then led Jones back to his apartment at gunpoint. At the apartment, one of the robbers stuck a gun in Jones's mouth and fired. Who fired is unclear, as Barnes would later testify he was in another room and only heard the fatal shot. The 4 were arrested fairly quickly, in part because Mitchell and Pearsall had essentially kidnapped Jones in front of multiple eyewitnesses. Barnes agreed to testify against the other 3 and gave the jury a play-by-play of what he claimed went down, which resulted in murder convictions against the others. Before he testified, Barnes received threats inside the Washington, D.C. jail, including a letter that said this: "I don't get mad, I get even. I live for revenge. If I lose the case, you're going to have enemies you didn't even know or you didn't even do nothing to." Because he'd been fully cooperative, expressed remorse, and offered testimony that one detective said was essential to the prosecution, Barnes expected leniency when he offered a guilty plea to second-degree murder charges, throwing himself to the mercy of the court. Instead, he was given 15 years to life in prison, with no guarantee of ever being a free man without first getting past a parole board. For the better part of the next decade, Barnes was circulated around various federal prisons, assaulted numerous times, and tried desperately to get himself out of the Bureau of Prisons system, without success. Almost anywhere in the U.S., a person who gets prosecuted for violating state law will be sent to that state's prison system. But Washington, D.C. is not a state, and only has a main jail with a relatively small capacity to house inmates with pending charges. The district has roughly 700,000 people and often a historically high crime rate of more than twice the national average. This was exacerbated in the 1990s when Washington, D.C. came to be known as the murder capital of the U.S., with an extraordinarily high homicide rate that was largely fueled by a booming crack cocaine market and warring drug trafficking rings. As a result, the local justice system saw a bottleneck effect of prosecutions that threatened to overpopulate the local jail. The solution devised and passed by Congress in 1997 became known as the National Capital Revitalization and Self-Government Improvement Act. And part of what it did was send people convicted of crimes in D.C. into the federal prison system, potentially hundreds or thousands of miles away from their loved ones. As a consequence, a disproportionate number of D.C. residents flooded into the Bureau of Prisons. Pretty much anyone with a felony conviction from D.C. ended up in a federal prison. This meant that a D.C. resident could be placed nearly anywhere within the federal prison system and expect to find at least a few people he knew from back home. For many from the D.C. area, the guarantee of kinship would be one of the few comforts of incarceration. For Keith Barnes, it would prove to be a nightmare. Over the years, D.C.-based prison gangs began strengthening their numbers within the federal system. The biggest beneficiary of this was a prison gang known as the D.C. Blacks, a group with a reputation for extreme violence that was formed in the 60s and 70s and which expanded nationwide. The D.C. Blacks were the main rivals of the Aryan Brotherhood in the federal prison system during the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, and the two gangs traded murders back and forth during these decades. But beyond that rivalry, the D.C. Blacks were a force to be reckoned with in prisons across the country, including what is known as Bloody Beaumont. On May 6th, 2005, the last full day of Keith Barnes's life, he arrived at USP Beaumont well aware of what lay ahead of him. He'd gone through this routine before, like earlier that year at USP Coleman in Florida, where a D.C. inmate had assaulted him so badly that prison officials kept him in segregated housing for several months, ostensibly for his own protection. There, confined to his cell 23 hours a day, he wrote letter after letter, pleading for help from the outside, to no avail. By then, he had determined that there was nowhere in the BOP system where he could be safe. After arriving at Area DB in USP Beaumont, Barnes decided that he would hide his identity by using a Middle Eastern-sounding name. But one of the inmates, 28-year-old Marwin Funk Mosley, saw right through it. Mosley, himself a D.C. native, conferred with others in the D.C. car, Charles Sherman and Michael Baycoat, and told them he believed the new arrival was a man named Keith Barnes who, quote, testified on some good dudes at D.C. jail. Mosley became fixated on the Barnes problem, so much so that when the leader of the D.C. car, a man who went by the nickname Tone, suggested simply assaulting Barnes to get him off their yard, Mosley refused to consider it. Quote, no, we're going to kill him. I'm going to kill him. While Baycoat and Sherman seemed reluctant to participate in the actual killing, Mosley found another D.C. inmate who stayed in another module who agreed to help. His name was Joseph Ebron. As a matter of fact, Joseph Ebron and Marwin Mosley had good reason to dislike government informants. Mosley was serving a life sentence as a part of a federal indictment into what prosecutors dubbed the 1-5 mob, a large-scale drug trafficking organization allegedly headed by a man named Tommy Edelin, who built up a massive illicit business in the 1980s and 90s, which received heroin and cocaine powder from a wholesale supplier in New York and sold crack, heroin, and cocaine through a network of middlemen and street-level dealers. Though prosecutors targeted dozens of alleged 1-5 members, Mosley was one of 4 to stand trial along Tommy Edelin and his father, Earl Edelin, on the theory that Mosley was one of the people willing to commit murder for Edelin on command. The group was convicted, largely on the word of ex-1-5 members who took the stand in exchange for leniency. One of those informants, Thomas Mussey Sims, testified that Mosley had threatened to murder him in the D.C. jail prior to his appearance in court. Mosley allegedly told him, "I'll kill you. It'll be a bloodbath." Similarly, Ebron was in prison because informants had placed him there. He was convicted in the May 1997 murder of Anthony Tate in the southeast Washington, D.C. area, the same region where the 1-5 mob operated. In fact, Ebron's own former brother-in-law, Bernard Pinckney, testified that he saw Ebron and a man named Stephen Good armed with a pistol and an AK-47 that day, looking for a man named Gregory Epps, who they intended to shoot. As Pinckney sat on the stand testifying against the two men, members of the audience began making slashing throat gestures at him. and a U.S. Marshal later said it appeared Ebron was giving them signals to do so each time. Pinckney was paid $12,000 for his testimony and placed in witness protection. Back to USP Beaumont. On May 7th, 2005, at around 7:45 p.m., inmate Charles Giles arrived at his cell, number 305, where he noticed a growing pool of blood beneath his feet. The body of Keith Barnes was there, lying on a top bunk, where it had been placed an estimated 2 to 3 hours earlier.
I have inmate Rain's number. Inmate Rain's.
Okay, this is 7 inmate Barnes.
Have y'all checked them?
13197-007. Come on over here. See where you can see it. You got the film here?
Multiple stab wounds to the heart.
Continuing care.
Initiated CPR. We've analyzed with
His autopsy showed something unusual. All 106 stab wounds were concentrated on a relatively small area of his chest, near his heart and lungs, which indicated that someone was holding Barnes down while another person struck him with a knife, over and over and over. When authorities reviewed surveillance footage of the stabbing, it spelled out Barnes's fate. Baycoat was seen going into his cell at around 5:20 p.m., and almost immediately Mosley and Ebron followed, wearing shirts wrapped around their heads in an attempt to throw off the security cameras. After Ebron and Mosley went in, Baycoat came out and walked to a nearby staircase, where he and Sherman sat for the next 9 minutes, as Barnes was getting stabbed to death inside. But there was something that the cameras didn't pick up, which would prove to be a major factor in the investigation down the line. For those 9 minutes, Charles Sherman was crying. The day after the stabbing, the BOP and FBI began interviewing Area DB inmates, when Sherman pulled a federal agent aside. For the past day, Sherman had been trying to reconcile what had happened to Barnes, but he had an even more pressing issue. Baycoat had observed his tears during the murder, and now Sherman felt the others saw him as a liability. Afraid that he would be next, he decided he would tell authorities what had happened if they could get him a ticket out of Beaumont. And that's how, just 15 hours after the murder, Sherman found himself in an interview room with Special Investigative Supervisor Patrick Townsend, where he talked about the stabbing, the discussions beforehand, and his own involvement as a lookout. Thanks in part to Sherman's cooperation, federal prosecutors secured a murder indictment in 2007. But before they did, a major event occurred that changed the trajectory of the case. Marwin Mosley was found deceased inside his cell on December 26, 2006, in what was ruled a suicide. That left Baycoat, Ebron, and Sherman to face the music. All three were indicted, though charges were quickly dropped against Sherman in exchange for his cooperation at trial. And Baycoat's attorneys argued that he was severely mentally ill, in part due to a severely low IQ, causing prosecutors to offer him a plea deal for what turned out to be 28 years in federal prison, which required him to sign a form that said Mosley and Ebron were the murderers. That left Ebron to pick up the slack for the alleged actions of the group. Prosecutors sought the death penalty. During his 2009 trial in Texas, Ebron portrayed himself as a peacemaker who had tried in vain to hold Mosley back after a simple conversation with Barnes went seriously awry. Prosecutors, meanwhile, went with the theory that Ebron had restrained Barnes while Mosley went to town on him with a prison shank. This was not just based on the testimony of Sherman, but another inmate named Lamont Bailey, who claimed that Mosley admitted to their respective roles in the murder, and that the stabbing was so prolonged, Mosley needed to stop and take breathers. Ebron testified that he was approached by 7 DC inmates who questioned him about Barnes, because Ebron and James "Rat" Carpenter had been former cellmates. Ebron said he told them to leave it alone because Carpenter and Barnes were, quote, working it out between the two of them. Later, he said he agreed to accompany Mosley to Barnes's cell to speak with him, but that Mosley became enraged when Barnes admitted to being a snitch, causing Mosley to cold-cock Barnes and knock him to the floor. He said he pleaded with Mosley to stop, and that he only agreed to move Barnes to the top bunk when Mosley threatened him. At the end of the trial, Jurors were left with a case without much physical evidence pointing to Ebron, and conflicting testimony between jailhouse informants and Ebron himself, all of whom had motives to lie. The jury deliberated for days before declaring itself hopelessly deadlocked. The defense moved for a mistrial over and over, but the motions were also denied. But then Judge Crone changed the tide. She dismissed a juror named Brittany Johnson, ruling Johnson had let her personal feelings get into the process. After Crone replaced Johnson with an alternate, jurors returned guilty verdicts against Ebron on murder and conspiracy charges. A week later, they sentenced him to death. He had an outburst in court when the verdict was read, which he later apologized for, writing, "I apologized to every single marshal and send my apology to the whole courtroom for my recklessness and disregard." Ebron's appeal was denied, his death sentence was upheld, and he remains at the maximum security federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. The aftermath of Barnes's murder proved embarrassing for the Bureau of Prisons. They were hit with a lawsuit by Barnes's family for failing to protect him, which was dismissed for a lack of jurisdiction. And a Washington Post columnist wrote a series of articles highlighting the case as a reason why the agency was too inept to protect those under its roof. At the time he was killed, Barnes was working diligently to get his sentence reduced. And unlike his efforts to transfer, he was making some headway in that realm. Instead, his enduring legacy will be that of a man who accurately predicted his own murder, but couldn't get people in power to care. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. If you have stories that you would like us to cover, tell us about them. Please like and subscribe.